Hello and welcome to EDH Rec's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDH Rec and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. The commander we're discussing this week shines bright like a diamond. Go-Shintai of Life's Origin is our new bona fide shrine commander. Every shrine we play also comes with a 1/1, doubling up the effectiveness of our Hondens, Sanctums, and other Go-Shintais. And with a 5-color activated ability in its color identity, Go-Shintai not only counts as a 5-color deck, but also helps us get back a bunch of juicy enchantments from the graveyard. Go-Shintai's EDH Rec page is, unsurprisingly, flooded with the other 16 shrines, but it also showcases a nice mix of enchantress effects too, including constellation effects that capitalize on the high number of enchantments our deck will naturally contain. Let's take a closer look. We'll grab Go-Shintai's average deck from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always, any swaps we make to the list must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Go-Shintai's average deck draws a lot of inspiration from Sisay Weatherlight Captain, who was formerly considered to be the default 5-color shrine commander. She appears in this very deck, in fact, because her effect helps us locate more of those shrines from within the 99. The shrines themselves take up a lot of deck slots here, which has an effect on the rest of the deck's available card slots. How much room does it have left to commit to other categories like removal or color fixing? These are tough balances, and for the record, I actually think this starting list does a great job with that. But before we can get to the upgrades or budget recommendations, let's start by examining Go-Shintai's core cards. Shrine players pretty quickly learn which of these enchantments are their favorites. Sanctum of Stonefangs and the red damaging shrines are the stars of the show here. Collecting shrines can be a somewhat gradual strategy, and these cards put a ticking clock on the game, inexorably drawing everything to a close, especially with the help of Sanctum of All, which tutors out these win cons for us and doubles up their triggers. I'm personally also a fan of the shrines that make lots of tokens. Over time, these make a substantially large army that our opponents can't really ignore. I'd say that they're a really great plan B. A lot of the other shrines play a supporting role, providing us with either extra mana or extra card advantage. I think the blue Go-Shintai is the easiest to misinterpret in this discussion though. Lost Wisdom reads as a mill win condition, but we actually want to turn that card inward and point it at ourselves, filling the graveyard so that our commander can pull more enchantments out of the yard with its activated ability. I think it's interesting too that a number of the shrines have effects that keep enemy creatures in check, either by destroying them, tapping them down at instant speed, or picking them off with damage effects. However, there's one shrine that we really have to keep an eye on, and that's Honden of Seeing Winds. This card is, in a word, dangerous. That draw effect is not a May ability. Our win conditions need a couple turns to melt our enemy's life totals, but Honden of Seeing Winds could genuinely deck us out in that amount of time. I wouldn't be surprised if some shrine players advocate against playing this one altogether. I still like it, but watch out for this one. It's a rascal. In fact, speaking of things that are a little rascally, watch out for rules misunderstanding with the shrines themselves, especially the tokens. Shrines are not a creature type. Shrines are an enchantment subtype, just like Curse is an enchantment subtype or how Equipment is an artifact subtype. The shrine type is attached to the enchantment part of the card, not the creature part of the card. If something asks you to name a creature type, you can't pick Shrine. It's a little weird, but it could come up in some games, so just keep that in mind. Outside of the shrines themselves, this average list is brimming with enchantresses, keeping our hands full and helping us dig to find more shrines. And digging is pretty important. We see tutors here too to help us find those Hondens and Sanctums, especially Sanctum of All, because if we don't actually play any shrines, then our commander won't do a whole lot for us. The rest of the deck fleshes itself out with other hilarious enchantment helpers too. Sphere of Safety keeps enemies off of our back, while the new Weaver of Harmony doubles up our favorite enchantment triggers. Even our removal, like Darksteel Mutation, helps keep enemy creatures in check, while still drawing us cards off of our enchantress triggers. Meanwhile, Doomwake Giant is a classic of the enchantress genre, one that really helps keep enemy boards clear. And if our opponents happen to disrupt us, well, Resurgent Belief and Dance of the Manse will bring them all back for another round. So yeah, this deck list is pretty awesome, but there are still some small things that I think we could improve. There will be 2 sections for this video. In the first section, I just want to make a few minor improvements, but in part 2, I'd like to work on a more budget-friendly brew for this deck, because its average price was kinda steep. Let's get things going with part 1. There are a lot of ways that you could build this deck. For example, plenty of players out there are using Go-Shintai's activated ability to cheat enormous, huge 10-mana Omniscient-style enchantments out of the graveyard right into play. And that's really cool stuff, but it isn't necessarily a strategy that we see reflected in this average list. So we're going to stick to amping up the Enchantress-style average that we're seeing represented here. But basically, I say this because I just want to point out that for being, quote, the Shrine deck, man, this deck has some really cool tricks up its sleeve. I don't have many cuts that I want to make to this deck. This starting list is terrific, and the cards that are here help contribute to the deck's balances really nicely. There's a lot of mana acceleration, a lot of color fixing, a respectable chunk of card advantage, and some solid defensive cards too, especially since several of our shrines perform a lot of those same roles themselves. However, one thing that isn't in balance is the land count. 34 lands isn't enough, especially if you're playing 5 colors, and need not just lands to play, but also options to play, so that you can play the mana sources in your hand that give you the colors you need. In my playtesting, I sometimes struggled to get the strategy off of the ground in the first place, and if opponents destroyed a bunch of creatures and enchantments later on, the small number of leftover lands in play rarely helped me claw back into the game. However, land counts are tricky in Enchantress decks. Enchantresses draw so many cards that you don't want to flood out with too many lands. You need enchantments in your hand so that you can keep drawing more cards from Enchantress triggers. This is why the best ramp sources in the deck are cards like Sanctum Weaver and Fertile Ground. They fix colors and could draw a bunch of cards. So I'm not gonna touch those for sure, but it does make me wonder if I should investigate the non-enchantment sources of ramp in the deck. For example, the sorceries that find lands are, in my opinion, generally pretty favorable, especially since they fix colors so well when they find lands with multiple land types, and a 5-color deck needs the color fixing really desperately. There are some 2-mana Mana Rocks that tap for any color in here too, which would certainly not draw us any cards because they're not enchantments, but they are really nice when we don't have any green mana just yet, and we need green mana to play other cards, like our other enchantments or even our commander. Then there are the enchantment cost reducer cards. You and I might disagree about this, but in my opinion, the cost reducers were actually the ones to go here. Starfield Mystic and Herald of the Pantheon reduce our enchantments, but are not themselves enchantments. This is tough, because I like how they help us play more enchantments, which our enchantresses in particular really love, of course, but I look at new cards like Jukai Naturalist, and I wonder if these non-enchantment versions are just getting phased out by other cards that not only assist the strategy, but which also are enchantments themselves and participate more directly in the strategy. Plus, a couple of our cards, including our commander, have activated abilities that these cost reducer effects don't help us with, which I think is pretty important too. I don't think there's an easy answer here, but when the deck has 17 sources of mana acceleration, and yet it still struggles to play a land every turn in the developing stages of the game, which is already our most vulnerable stage of the game, I think we can get away with trading some of these slight mana sources here to make things more reliable and a little less idealized. So I'm cutting those and I'm adding in lands, starting with Path of Ancestry, which comes in tapped, but which will give us all of our colors and even a few incidental scries here and there. Oh, and there was no basic mountain in the starting deck. That's weird, right? I'd like to have the option to find a basic mountain if we need one. This takes us to 36 lands, still with 15 mana acceleration sources, and I'm already feeling a lot better about it. Alright, the next change is going to be a little odd, but I don't think I care for Calyx very much. Like I said, I'm critical of the non-enchantment cards in the deck. I don't know what it is, but every time I've seen Calyx, I've just not been super impressed. I've seen him whiff with his +1, I've seen people get out from underneath his Oblivion Ring minus ability, and even though his ultimate is really nice looking, I don't necessarily trust us to get there reliably. Maybe I'm just weird, but I'm more in the mood to put a one-sided board wipe into the deck instead. Extinguish All Hope kills off any non-enchantment creatures, and you know, I think it's very nice of it to leave our commander and all of our little shrine tokens alive. This thing can be a real blowout. After that, I only have 2 more cards I want to add, but that means I have to make 2 cuts too. There are 2 cards in this deck that I adored at first, but which over time I suspected were maybe a smidge win more. Strionic Resonator doubles up one of our shrine triggers, and Archon of Sun's Grace makes oodles of tokens. First thing to note, neither of these are enchantments, so we won't draw extra cards from them. I know I keep saying that over and over, but it's an important thing to note. When one enchantment draws you like 3 or 4 cards, it really stands out when you have a hand of lands and creatures and artifacts that don't draw you anything at all. I'll start by addressing the Resonator. I love that it could double up the effects of one of our win conditions, but the thing is, we have 2 other cards in the deck that can already do that, and they're both enchantments. Plus, the method of getting into a lethal board position where our sanctums are draining 10 life from our enemies each turn is itself kind of a lengthy process, and Strionic is less useful at helping set that stage up and more useful once we've reached that endgame stage. It's not useless, obviously, it just shines most when we're already in a winning position. And compared to the 2 enchantments we have that help us out in already similar ways, I personally felt like Strionic was a cool idea, but that another card might serve me better. Then there's the Archon. Constellation is great in this deck. We have enchantments hitting the field all over the place. But the 2/2 tokens didn't impress me as much when we're already flooding the field with dozens of 1/1s from our other shrine effects. The Archon's tokens do fly, which is important, but we have other token-making enchantments in this deck that already make flying tokens, and bigger ones. At first, I wanted to keep the Archon in the deck to help with flying defenses, but after playing the deck more, well, our defenses are actually already pretty good. I like Archon, I don't think it's a bad card, I don't think Strionic is either. They just both happen to do things that our deck here is already doing pretty well on its own. So what are those cuts in service of then? Easy. Shrine Tutors. We have 2, maybe 3 enchantment tutors in this list already, but yeah, we need more of them. This deck is hungry to find its shrines, especially in the early stages of the game, before we've gotten the chance to set up defenses and enchantresses that help us start digging. Search for Glory finds a legend, and all our shrines are legendary. And Zur gives us a tiny shrine every time he attacks. Or he finds our removal, or ramp, or pillow forts, whatever we need. These cards help us get our shrines and our entire strategy online. Before we get to the budget section in part 2, let's discuss some honorable mentions for players who would like their Go-Shintai decks to be even more extravagant. It turns out there's an enchantress missing from this deck, Argothian Enchantress, because it's a very spendy card, but it's also a very good card. It's also wise to amp up the removal and protection here with cards like Song of the Dryads or the ultimate pillow fort, Collective Restraint. With all 5 colors in our deck, this card becomes an uber ghostly prison, which is super rad. Speaking of protecting ourselves, I'd be remiss not to mention Greater Oromancy, which is so amazing, but also the price on this card kinda made my eyes bug out, you know? And of course, the tip-top Enchantress decks know that they'll aim for a Serra Sanctum too, cause yeah, that is a herkin' lot of mana. Like I said, just a few swaps and we're done. The starting list was already terrific, hence why making any cuts at all was so agonizing. You can find a link to this version of the deck below, but that was just part 1. Now it's time for part 2. Let's make this deck more budget-friendly. A few of the older Hondens have increased in price recently, but for the most part, the shrines themselves do not break the bank. The original average decklist starting price that we saw was not resultant from the shrines. That was resultant from all the stuff surrounding the shrines. But the core strategy here can adapt to any price threshold and still knock people's socks off. So let's do that. Okay, so nearly $300 of this average deck's price is solely wrapped up in the mana base. You should certainly play with whichever lands you'll most enjoy, but for the sake of brevity, I'm going to assume that they're all no-goes for a budget mana base. Fetches, shocks, triomes, these are all great, but don't worry if you don't have a, quote, perfect mana base. Play at your comfort level, you know? We're cutting 20 lands here, and it's saving hundreds on the price. Our budget base starts off with a classic foundation of tri-lands. Tapped, but reliable. I don't mind a tempo hit if it means this deck gets its colors. I'm also going to add a few more basics, but the real weird choice here will be the inclusion of a small number of budget dual-typed lands, specifically those that are either a forest or a plains. The reason for this is because I'm adding a Krosan Verge. I quite like the ability on this card to fix up our mana by finding whichever dual types we need to sort out our colors. Wizards of the Coast, if you happen to be listening, I think it would be really cool if y'all made Krosan Verge into a full land cycle. Please, please, please. After that, let's find some replacements for any card in the deck that is over $10. First, there's a Rhystic Study in the list, and I think a Whirlwind of Thought would make a fine substitute. We cast a lot of non-creature spells. This is basically an honorary Enchantress's presence. Next, this deck contains two very important protective cards, Heroic Intervention and Teferi's Protection. These are huge to protect a big board full of shrines, but we can protect on a budget too. A simple negate will go really far to stop enemies from killing our commander or our whole board, and a Cosmic Intervention is pretty clean for this deck as well. If our stuff gets demolished, it'll come right back, and Go-Shintai will even supply us with a bunch of new shrine tokens while we're at it. That's rad. There's an expensive tutor in this deck too, but if we like searching for enchantments and don't want to spend $40 doing it, maybe a Moon-Blessed Cleric would feel more up our alley. This thing's just a common, but this effect is very good. Kudos to you, Cleric. Alright, the next two expensive cuts are a little sad. Hollowed Haunting and Paradox Haze are a pretty penny right now. One makes big flying tokens, and the other amplifies our upkeep shrines. We could search for direct exchanges on these, but to be honest, I'm not sure if we need to. Like I said before, we make a lot of tokens already, and the Paradox Haze doesn't amplify 100% of our shrines anyway. It does amplify Sanctum of All's tutor ability, and that's one of the first enchantments we try to get into play, no doubt, no doubt. So I still respect the effect of Paradox Haze, but I think we're okay without directly trying to replicate this exact effect with another card swap. And we could instead take this opportunity to ramp up this deck's insurance policies a bit more. I think this is a great deck for swift reconfiguration. Flash it in, turn a creature into a vehicle. For one thing, that's hilarious. This can really shut down a big beefy attack. For another thing, it's an enchantment that will draw us cards. But really the reason I like it so much is because it's kinda protection for our commander if we want it to be. Turn Go-Shintai into a non-creature? That makes it a lot harder to kill, no longer kicking the bucket from random board wipes. I like that protection and versatility very, very much. For the other insurance policy idea, I'm going to present three different options. Brilliant Restoration, Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, and Eerie Ultimatum. All 7 mana, all designed to get back a bunch of stuff from the graveyard. Primeval's requires us to have a legendary creature, but our commander is pretty integral to the whole strategy, so that might be a restriction that doesn't feel too much like a restriction to you. Eerie Ultimatum and Brilliant Restoration, meanwhile, are excellent, but they can be tough to cast in a 5-color deck. I think any one of these three are perfectly respectable choices, and great ways to get back all of our stuff. I'm personally going to opt for the Ultimatum, but any one of these three are an excellent choice. And I especially like casting it after the Go-Shintai of Lost Wisdom has been filling our graveyard for a couple turns. Lastly, our most important losses in the budget culling are the expensive mana-fixing cards. Smothering Tithe, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and Chromatic Lantern are all above $10. And they're big losses. These are big shoes to fill, but we'll try our hardest. First, there's a simple Trace of Abundance. Nothing flashy, just another form of enchantment-based ramp, and unlike some of the other options out there, this one is only a quarter. I worried that the casting cost on this one would be an issue at first, but it actually hasn't bugged me too bad. Then, I'd like to suggest Honor-Worn Shaku. All these shrines are legendary, and it seems silly to just leave them untapped all the time when we could be using them to create a bunch more mana. This thing is pretty darn cool. However, neither of these quite help us with the color fixing like the Lantern or the Dryad did, so that's why my last edition is also my weirdest. Celestial Dawn is one of the strangest cards I think I've ever seen. It turns all of our lands into plains, but it also lets us use white mana as though it was mana of any color. Any other type of mana can only be used as though it was colorless mana, but that's generally not a problem for us, not when we're fixing up 5 colors worth of mana. A lot of the cards out there that let us turn all of our mana into any color type can be very, very pricey cards, but this is a cheap card that fixes up mana in bizarre ways. And since the whole idea of a shrine deck is to use some funky enchantments from some older sets, I think Celestial Dawn is right at home. Alright, there we have it. Go forth, Go-Shintai! That price looks a lot nicer to me. You can find a link to both deck lists in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. Go-Shintai appreciates you stopping by, but now it's your time to shrine. If you have any recommendations for cards that your fellow Go-Shintai players ought to be using in their decks too, make sure you leave your suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.